Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into a warm, dark river valley where the mud is soft as cake batter and the air smells like reeds, smoke, and distant rain. You're standing in that in-between hour when a city is still half dream, half construction site, and someone is pressing a wet clay tablet flat with their thumb as if they are pinning a secret to the world. Our title is bold, a little dangerous, and honestly, kind of ridiculous in the best way. The Anunnaki created humans twice. The first was erased. Now, some parts of what you hear tonight are widely accepted history. The everyday stuff of Mesopotamian cities, scribes, temples, and crops. Some parts are interpretation, where a careful reading might suggest meanings that are not written in neon. And some parts are calm, what-if, imagination, cinematic and soft, like fog on water. You probably will not survive this in the sense that you may fall asleep and wake up with a crick in your neck. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments so we can all pretend we are hosting a global pajama party for ancient history. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk along the edge of a slow river. Not as a tourist, not as a hero, just as you, curious and slightly underprepared for mud that wants to keep your sandals as a snack. The land here is low and wide. Water is the boss. It decides where the fields will be, where the paths will be, where the people will build, and how often they will have to rebuild. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamia grows into a world of city-states, with temples at the center of economy and ritual, and scribes turning spoken promises into pressed wedges of cuneiform. That part is solid ground. You can almost feel it under your feet. Packed earth, sun-baked bricks, the rhythm of work. A temple rises ahead. Not a single building, but a whole complex. Courtyards and storerooms and workshops, all humming with practical holiness. Someone is measuring barley. Someone is sealing a jar with clay. Someone is arguing about a goat as if the future of the universe depends on it. In a way, it does. Because order is everything here. Order is survival. In this world, a flood is not just weather, it is a judge. A drought is not just a hot summer, it is a slow eviction notice. You enter a quieter room where a scribe sits cross-legged, a reed stylus in hand. The scribe is not writing a novel. He is writing reality. Receipts, lists, rations, names, but tucked into the same culture that loves lists like they are an art form. There are also stories, hymns, myths, songs that explain why the world feels the way it feels. Archaeology suggests that these texts live in archives, copied and recopied, not because everyone believes every line is literal fact, but because the lines matter. They explain the relationship between people, work, kings, gods, and the fragile promise that tomorrow will resemble today. In the mainstream view, the Anunnaki are a group of deities in Mesopotamian tradition, often linked with the underworld or divine assembly depending on the text and era. Their roles shift across time because myths are not frozen. They move like water. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians do not hold one single uniform religious system across every city and century. Instead, they have a living tapestry with local preferences, political pressures, and scribal fashion. That is important because it means you should treat any single version of a story as one window, not the entire house. Still, you lean closer. You are here for the idea that humans were made, then remade. not as a simple fairy tale, but as a claim whispered through interpretation. One interpretation is that creation stories can echo social engineering, a way to explain how labor and duty become sacred. Another interpretation is that the gods in these myths mirror human institutions, especially temples and kingships. And if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the double creation idea becomes a metaphor for resets, societies reorganizing, populations shifting, old systems failing, new ones replacing them. But tonight, you do not want dry lectures. You want to feel the clay. So you imagine your hands in a basin, mixing mud and water. It is cool at first, then warm as your skin gives it heat. The clay is thick, gritty, alive with little pebbles and plant bits. Your fingers knead it the way a baker kneads dough. Except the recipe is older than your sense of time. In many Mesopotamian myths, humans are shaped from clay, sometimes mixed with divine substance, sometimes linked with the idea of blood, breath, or the essence of a god. Archaeology suggests these are symbolic languages, reflecting craft traditions and the everyday experience of making bricks, pots, and seals. When your whole world is built from mud, of course, life itself begins in mud. You look around and you notice something that feels almost too modern. There is specialization, there is planning, there is a chain of responsibility. People are not just wandering around having philosophical thoughts about starlight. They are working. They are accounting for work. They are feeding workers. In this setting, a creation story can be read as a story about why work exists and why it is organized. A careful reading might suggest that when a myth says humans were made to relieve the gods of labor, it is also saying something about who is supposed to work for whom, and why that arrangement is not just convenient, but cosmically appropriate. And then you meet the mist. The mist is the part where you let your mind step off the solid ground for a moment, without pretending it is proven. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So, here is the mist. You imagine a quiet workshop inside the temple complex. A room kept warm and clean. A lamp flickers with animal fat, making the shadows buttery and slow. Bowls sit in a row. Reeds are bundled like paintbrushes. A low chant vibrates through the floor. Not scary, just steady, like a heartbeat you can borrow. In this imagined scene, the Anunnaki are not aliens with tool belts and laser pointers. They are divine administrators. The story's way of giving a face to power. They do not need to be literal engineers for the idea to work. They are the narrative masks for forces that shape human life. You, in second person, stand in that room as if you are allowed to watch. And you notice that the people telling the story are very aware of process. Not magic fireworks. Process, mixing, shaping, timing, words spoken at the right moment. The creation is not instant. It is managed. It is performed like a ritual and like a craft. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is deeply ritualistic, and that priests and temple staff perform ceremonies to maintain order between divine and human realms. Within that worldview, a story about making humans is also a story about maintaining the system. It is about purpose. It is about why you wake up and haul grain and pay taxes and show up for festivals. It is about why the temple matters, if that sounds unromantic. Remember that ancient people also like romance. They just often romance the things that keep them alive, like irrigation. Now, the double creation hook is where you tilt your head. In mainstream texts, you can find themes of human imperfection, divine dissatisfaction, and catastrophic resets. not always framed as two separate creations in a neat numbered list. But the ingredients are there. Humans are made. Humans misbehave. Order cracks. A flood or plague or divine decision wipes the slate, and life begins again. Historians still argue whether these stories preserve memories of specific disasters, like major floods, or whether they are mostly moral narratives, designed to explain suffering and justify authority. That debate matters, because it changes how you read everything that follows. But for this first section, you stay close to the origin moment. You focus on the first shaping, the first breath, the first instructions. You step outside, and the city is louder now. Donkeys complain. Children run. Someone is singing while grinding grain. And it is the kind of song that makes work tolerable. Like your favorite playlist, except it is all percussion and existential devotion. You walk past a canal and see the water moving in a straight line, a human idea imposed on nature. This is the point where the story of creation and the reality of civilization start to rhyme, because civilization itself is a kind of creation, not from nothing, but from mud and rules and repetition. The evidence we do have points to early urban development in southern Mesopotamia. With increasing social complexity, craft production, long-distance trade, and record-keeping, all of that requires coordination. Coordination requires authority. Authority requires narratives. Narratives explain why authorities is acceptable, even when it is annoying. You pause at a market stall where someone sells little clay figurines. They are rough, thumb-pressed, not refined. A face, a belly, a posture. They look like people, but also like symbols of people. You pick one up. It fits your palm like a secret, and you imagine a storyteller saying, "Long ago, the divine council looked down at a world that needed hands. Not because the gods were lazy in a sitcom way, but because order needs agents. So they shape humans, and they assign them roles: farmer, builder, scribe, singer, soldier, midwife, brewer. Because, yes, brewing is a sacred duty and, frankly, the most relatable part of any ancient religion. In the misty interpretation lane, you can read this as a mythic reflection of how institutions recruit bodies into systems. The story says you are made for work. The temple says you are fed for work. The king says you are protected for work. It is a loop. One interpretation is that calling this arrangement divine helps it feel inevitable. And if you are listening sleepily, you might notice how familiar that sounds. Modern life also has a way of acting like your email inbox was ordained by the heavens. Still, you do not flatten it into cynicism. You let the myth be myth. You let it be poetry. You let it be a way ancient people make sense of their lives, their fragility, their brilliance. The night deepens. The fan hum in your room, wherever you are, starts to blend with the imagined hum of insects along the river. You look up at the sky. Mesopotamians watch the sky with devotion. What's broadly accepted is that they track celestial movements and develop systems of omens over time, seeing patterns and messages in planets, eclipses, and strange lights. In a mainstream safe way, that is part science, part religion, part politics. In an interpretation angle, you can say that the sky becomes a mirror for the city, ordered, yet full of warnings. And now, a small mystery note slips in, gentle and labeled. A popular rumor, much later in modern retellings, treats the Anunnaki as literal visitors, as if the myths are secret reports. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps showing up because it is cinematic and because humans love upgrading metaphors into machines. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood, not a claim. What if the stories are pointing at something else? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you stand there in the city's edge, half in history, half in imagination. You feel the clay drying on your hands. You hear the scribe's stylus tapping, tap, tap, as if the sound itself is a little metronome that keeps time for civilization. And you feel the first creation ideas settle into your mind, not as a final answer, but as a setup for tension. Humans made with intention, placed into a system, given a purpose that is equal parts gift and burden. You watch a worker carry a basket of bricks. The worker's shoulders are strong, but you can see the fatigue too. The worker pauses, looks at the temple, and keeps going, in a quiet way. That is the heartbeat under the myth. The story says you were made. The day says you must keep being made. Every morning, by your own effort. And as the lamp smoke curls into the night, you allow one last soft what if. Cinematic and calm. What if there was an earlier shaping? A first version that did not fit this system? What if the clay took a different form, a different temperament, a different kind of mind? That is not a fact tonight. That is a question you set gently on the table, like a clay figurine that might or might not be a god. Might or might not be you. You breathe in, read, smoke, river. The workshop door closes with a soft thud. Not ominous, just final enough to make you curious. And the city keeps humming. You drift deeper into the temple district where the air shifts from river damp to baked brick and warm dust. The streets narrow, not because anyone is trying to be dramatic, but because real cities grow the way vines do, squeezing into every useful space. You pass a wall where sunlight catches tiny glints in the plaster. Ground shell, maybe, or crushed stone. Even the walls have recipes here. A doorway opens into a scribal school, and the noise is a different kind of noise. The scratch of styluses, the soft thunk of tablets set down, and a chorus of young voices repeating lines like a spell that pays rent. A teacher paces with the relaxed menace of someone who has corrected the same mistake for 40 years. Your eyes land on a basket of clay tablets still damp at the edges, waiting for practice. Archaeology suggests that students learn by copying, and copying, and copying, building muscle memory in the wrist and mind, and that many tablets we find are basically ancient homework, full of lists and exercises. It is comforting, in a slightly bleak way, to realize that even 5,000 years ago, someone is staring at a lesson thinking, I would rather wrestle a crocodile than do another verb list. You sit quietly, invisible in the corner like a respectful ghost, and you listen as the teacher moves from simple signs to more complex ones. The reed stylus is cut at an angle, and every press leaves a wedge. Cuneiform is not ink. It is impact. The writing is physical, almost percussive. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. If the city is a drum, this room is the metronome. Most historians agree that writing in Mesopotamia begins largely for administration, recording goods, rations, land, labor, taxes, and temple inventories. That mainstream fact matters for tonight because it tells you what this culture values enough to preserve on clay. When the world is uncertain, you preserve certainty in lists. You preserve control. You preserve memory that does not rot. And then, once you have the tool, you use it for everything else. Hymns, epics, omens, prayers, legal codes, and myths about why humans exist at all. A careful reading might suggest that creation stories in this environment are not only spiritual narratives, but also ideological tools. Not propaganda in a cartoon villain sense, more like a framework that makes the world feel coherent. If you're told you were made for a purpose, the chaos hurts less. if you are told the system is cosmic. The unfair parts can feel like fate instead of failure. That interpretation is not the only way to read these stories, but it is a useful lens. The teacher lifts a tablet and points to a line that mixes familiar words with sacred names. The students repeat it, and the repetition turns language into something like music. The names of gods enter the room, not as distant thunder, but as vocabulary. In many Mesopotamian traditions, gods are not shy, abstract ideas. They are personalities with domains, households, rivalries, and responsibilities. That makes the divine feel close to daily life. It also makes the mythic world feel like a reflection of the human ones, which is exactly why the myths can carry social meaning. You watch a student smooth a tablet with wet fingers. The clay shines for a moment. Then the stylus presses in, making a crisp mark. This is how an idea becomes durable. It is also how an idea becomes editable, because clay can be reshaped until it dries. A scribe can rework a line, copy it differently, emphasize one detail, minimize another. Over centuries, that adds up. Not necessarily as a conspiracy, but as a natural consequence of human copying. Archaeology suggests that scribes often preserve older material while also adapting it, blending regional traditions and aligning stories with local temples and patrons. One interpretation is that myth can function like a political map. Different cities highlight different gods, and different dynasties prefer different origin stories. That does not mean anyone is lying. It means myth is alive. You follow the teacher to a shelf where finished tablets sit upright like books with no covers. Some are small and personal. Some are larger and formal. A seal impression marks ownership, the way you might put your name on a lunch bag. Except this lunch bag might contain the fate of your property rights. Now the mystery begins to creep in. Not as a claim, but as a mood. Because you notice something odd. The same themes appear again and again, in slightly different costumes. Humans are shaped. Humans are instructed. Humans fail. Humans are corrected. It can feel like a blueprint, and that feeling is what makes modern listeners lean forward. What if these stories are not only religious poetry, but also fragments of a lost manual? To be clear, that is interpretation, not certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The myths can be read as if they are describing procedures, but that may simply be because ritual language is procedural by nature. Ritual is a sequence. Craft is a sequence. Law is a sequence. So myth borrows that shape. Still, you imagine a scribe copying a line about mixing clay with something divine, and you imagine the scribe pausing, as if the line is heavier than the others. The stylus hovers. The scribe presses anyway. The wedge marks appear. The line survives. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often use craft metaphors. Forming, molding, building, measuring, weaving. That is mainstream and stable. But tonight, you let the metaphor glow a little brighter. You treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if it is hinting at an anxious truth? That humans are made not just by biology, but by systems, by institutions, by training, by the constant shaping of behavior. You step out of the school and walk into a courtyard where workers carry baskets of clay. A kiln breathes heat like a sleeping animal. Bricks line up in tidy stacks, each one a small rectangle of permanence. This place is addicted to building. That is not an insult. It is survival. Floods and erosion and time are always trying to unmake what people make. So people answer by making again. A more cautious explanation could be that the double creation idea comes from this constant cycle. Build, break, rebuild. Not necessarily one dramatic moment, but 1,000 small resets. And yet, the mind loves big stories. The mind wants a single event, a single decision, a single erase button. You walk past a group of officials weighing grain. A scale creaks. A clerk calls out numbers. Someone stamps a seal into clay, leaving a tiny image. A lion or a star or a figure with a beard that could cut glass. Most historians agree that cylinder seals are a hallmark of Mesopotamian administration and identity, rolled across clay to mark ownership and legitimacy. The seal is small, but it carries authority. In an interpretation lane, you can see the seal as a symbol of creation too, a pattern pressed into soft material, leaving a repeatable design. The city itself is a seal rolled across the landscape. Now, the fringe tidbit arrives, wearing a big hat and trying to look casual. A popular rumor claims that certain ancient texts are coded records of genetic engineering, and that the gods are actually advanced beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because it turns metaphors into machines, and machines into drama. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it is thin. There is no clear, documented bridge from cuneiform myth to laboratory procedure. But as a bedtime mystery, it offers a cinematic angle. It invites you to imagine the temple workshop as a lab, the bowl of clay as a mixing vessel, the chant as a protocol. The trick is to enjoy the mood without mistaking it for proof. You keep walking, and you reach a different kind of room, one that feels quieter and heavier, like the air itself is storing secrets. This is an archive space, cool and shaded. Tablets are arranged, some tagged with brief labels. The order is not perfect, but it is intentional. You feel the strange comfort of knowledge stored in bulk, like a pantry for the mind. The evidence we do have points to large collections of tablets in various Mesopotamian sites, showing that writing becomes a major tool of state and temple power. That mainstream fact is your anchor. Then you notice something else. Some tablets are clean and crisp, others are broken. Some are only fragments. A corner here, a few signs there. You realize that what survives is partly accident. Fire that bakes clay instead of destroying it. Collapse that buries an archive instead of scattering it. Someone deciding to reuse a tablet as building fill. History is not a neat bookshelf. It is a messy storage closet where the important papers are under a blanket and the cat is sitting on them. One interpretation is that the gaps in our knowledge create space for grand theories. When you have fragments, you can imagine the missing parts. Sometimes that imagination is reasonable. Sometimes it turns into a carnival. Tonight, you walk the line. You enjoy the carnival lights, but you keep one hand on the railing. You pick up a broken tablet fragment, just in your mind, because in reality, you are not allowed to touch museum pieces. And also, your fingerprints are not part of the ancient record. The fragment shows a few wedge marks and a divine name. That is enough to start a whole narrative in your head. You think about how scribes might choose which stories to copy. You think about how kings might prefer stories that make their rule feel natural. You think about how temples might emphasize a creation that places them at the center of human purpose. Historians still argue whether the most famous Mesopotamian epics and myths reflect specific historical events, or whether they are primarily literary and religious constructions that gather many memories into one story. That debate is not just academic. It is the difference between reading the myths as a foggy mirror of reality and reading them as symbolic theater. Both readings can be meaningful, but they lead you to different moods. Your mood tonight is a slow drift into the idea of design, not necessarily designed by literal engineers, but designed by narrative. You imagine a scribe thinking, people need to know why they work, why they suffer, why they obey. So the scribe writes a world where humans are made with intention, where the divine assembly has meetings like city councils, where decisions are made that ripple down into farms and households. You can almost see the divine council as a metaphor for bureaucracy, and you can almost hear the gods complaining about labor like anyone complains about Mondays, which, yes, means the universe has always been powered by complaints. One of your light jokes floats by. If the gods were truly divine, they would have invented weekends. But apparently even immortals have project deadlines. Outside, the afternoon is leaning toward evening. Shadows stretch. The city's smell changes. More cooking smoke. More animal warmth. The market thickens with voices. A musician plucks a stringed instrument and the notes slide across the air like oil on water. You stop at a store where a vendor sells little charms. Tiny clay tokens. Maybe for luck. Maybe for fun. Maybe because humans love carrying meaning in their pockets. You hold one, and you think about how meaning is made twice. Once by the hands that form it, and again by the hands that interpret it. That is the heart of tonight's section. The texts are formed. Then they are read. Then they are reread. Then they are copied. Each step is a kind of creation. A more cautious explanation could be that the double creation theme arises from this layered process. Not one literal lab event, not one dramatic redo, but many retellings, each shaping the human role slightly differently. Over time, those differences can look like two versions of humanity. One imagined earlier, one imagined later. The first can feel like it was erased, not by a cosmic wipe, but by editorial gravity, by the slow preference for one story over another. And now, you allow yourself one more soft cinematic what if. In the cool archive, in the shadow of tablets, you imagine a missing series, a set of lines that do not survive. A scribe once copied them, but the tablet cracked, and the fragments were used to level a floor. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it is conceivable that some versions of the creation story were more explicit about failure, about a first attempt that did not hold. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The city lights begin to appear. Not electric, but warm points of flame. Lamps glow in doorways. The kiln's mouth glows like a slow sunrise. You feel sleepiness tug at you, the way warm air tugs at a curtain. You turn back toward the scribal school one last time, and you hear the students repeating signs, practicing the shape of permanence. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. Their voices blend into a lullaby of administration. And somewhere in that rhythm, you feel the story sharpening into a question, calm and steady, like a candle flame that does not flicker even when the night wind slides past the door. You step into a neighborhood where the buildings sit shoulder to shoulder like tired workers leaning on each other. The brick walls are patched in different shades, because repairs happen whenever they have to, not when they look pretty. In the distance, a drumbeat marks time for a crew lifting timber. A dog barks once, then decides the universe is not worth the effort. The air tastes like roasted barley and river minerals. That faint metallic tang you get near water that has traveled a long way. Most historians agree that life in ancient Mesopotamian cities is dense and organized, with households clustered near canals and temples, and with labor divided into jobs that keep the whole machine running. You can feel the organization in the way people move. Not randomly, but with purpose. Carrying baskets, trading goods, checking seals, calling out measurements. A city like this is not just a place to live. It is a system you live inside. You find a quiet corner where a storyteller has gathered a small circle. Not a stage, not a spotlight, just a low wall to sit on, and a voice that knows how to hold attention. The storyteller speaks in that steady rhythm people use when they want their words to stick. The story is about the gods, yes, but it is also about people. It is about why people sometimes feel like they are too much, too loud, too many, too unpredictable. The storyteller's eyes flick to the street, then back to the listeners, as if the city itself is the punchline. In several Mesopotamian narratives, there is a theme of divine dissatisfaction with humanity. Sometimes the complaint is framed as noise, or disturbance, or disorder. What's broadly accepted is that ancient myths often personify chaos as something the gods dislike, because chaos threatens the cosmic and social order. One interpretation is that this noise can reflect real pressures of urban life, crowding, conflict, overwork, and the strain on resources. That is not the only interpretation, but it fits the setting. Cities are loud. Cities are complicated. Cities create problems as fast as they create opportunities. You listen as the storyteller describes an early kind of humanity. Not necessarily a different species, but a different version in the story's imagination. These first humans are energetic, impulsive, hard to manage. They multiply, they argue, they push the boundaries of what is acceptable. The storyteller does not describe them as evil, more like untrained, like a herd that has not learned the fence exists. If the double creation idea is treated as a possibility rather than a conclusion, this is where it can start to feel plausible as a narrative pattern. The first version appears, then trouble follows, not because the gods are petty, but because the world needs balance, and balance is fragile. In a mainstream safe reading, the story is a moral and social lesson. In a more interpretive reading, it is a mirror of how institutions deal with populations they cannot fully control. The storyteller's voice drops a little, as if speaking softer makes the content heavier. A divine council gathers. There are arguments. There are compromises. There are decisions that affect people who never get a vote. You almost laugh at the familiarity. Because yes, divine councils sound suspiciously like committees, and committees have been ruining everyone's day since time began. One light joke slides in gently. Even the gods, apparently, cannot escape meetings that could have been an email. But you do not stay in modern sarcasm. You stay in the city. You stay in the warm dust and the flicker of lamps. You watch faces in the crowd. A young woman listens with her chin on her fist, eyes half closed, like she is already using the story as a lullaby. A man with a calloused neck nods at the mention of labor, as if the myth is describing his back pain in poetic form. The story's first humans are described as costly, not only emotionally, but practically. They require feeding, they require governance, they require limits. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian states developed systems of taxation, ration distribution, and labor management, especially around temples and palaces. That mainstream fact is the real-world counterpart to the myth's complaint. A city needs administration. Administration needs compliance. Compliance is easiest when people believe the system is natural. One interpretation is that myths about imperfect early humans can encode lessons about obedience. If humans are too noisy, then quiet becomes virtue. If humans are too unruly, then discipline becomes sacred. That reading is suggestive, not conclusive. But it is a useful way to understand why these stories remain meaningful for the people telling them. Still, the mystery side offers a cinematic angle. You imagine the first humans as an experiment that does not behave the way the designers hoped. Not in a lab coat sense necessarily, but in a narrative sense. The story paints the first attempt as unstable. You can picture it like a pot pulled from a kiln too early. Still soft, still warping, A craftsperson would not call it evil. They would call it not finished. You wander away from the storyteller and into a workshop yard where potters work near a kiln. The heat is constant, like the breath of something large. A potter shapes a vessel with hands that move confidently, and the clay responds. You watch the rim rise, the body widen, the base narrow. It looks effortless until you try to imagine doing it yourself. And then you realize you would make something that resembles a sad pancake with ambitions. Another light joke floats by. If humans were truly made from clay, some of us were definitely made on a Friday afternoon. The potter trims the vessel and sets it aside. Nearby, a worker stamps a mark into wet clay, a sign of ownership or purpose. The stamp is decisive. It does not ask permission. That image sticks in your mind, because it is exactly how myths can feel. They stamp meaning into experience. You keep moving, and you reach a canal where water slides past in a disciplined line. A group of laborers clears debris from the bank. Their tools are simple, but their coordination is complex. Most historians agree that irrigation and canal maintenance are central to Mesopotamian agriculture and urban survival. That is mainstream ground again, firm under your feet. In an interpretation lane, the canal becomes a metaphor for order itself. Water wants to spread and flood and wander. People persuade it to behave. Humans, too, want to spread and wander. Institutions persuade them to behave. And then you encounter the story's darker lullaby. Still kept PG-13 and calm. The gods decide to reduce the disturbance, not necessarily through one dramatic event in every version, but through measures that cut humanity down to size. In some tellings, there are calamities, hardships, disruptions. Scholars continue to debate how to read those calamity motifs. Are they reflections of real disasters, or narrative devices to explain why suffering exists, or warnings about crossing boundaries? Historians still argue whether these calamity themes preserve memory of specific crises such as flood events and societal stress, or whether they function mainly as moral storytelling about order and hubris. That debate gives you permission to stay balanced. You do not have to claim certainty. You can acknowledge that the myths may contain layered memories. Cities flood, crops fail, disease spreads, political shifts topple old arrangements. In the ancient world, a string of bad years can feel like a cosmic decision. The mystery theory angle, carefully labeled, adds a different flavor. A fringe idea proposes that the noise complaint describes not literal sound, but a mismatch in design, as if the first humans think too independently or process information in a way that challenges the system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for it is thin, but it is an intriguing metaphor. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a way to talk about how societies sometimes fear certain kinds of minds. Minds that question, minds that improvise, minds that do not fit the template. You watch the laborers at the canal again. One of them pauses, wipes sweat, and looks up at the temple tower. The expression is not rebellion, not worship, just calculation. How long until the ration distribution? How many hours left? How many baskets? That look is human. It is also the kind of look that makes rulers nervous, because calculation can turn into critique. In the street, a procession passes slowly, carrying offerings. A priest chants, and the chant is not frantic. It is measured. That matters. The religion here is not only about ecstatic mystery, it is also about routine. Routine calms chaos. Routine tells people where to stand. Routine tells the gods you are doing your part. Most historians agree that rituals, festivals, and offerings are central to Mesopotamian religious life. and the temples serve as economic and social hubs. That mainstream fact grounds you again. The storyteller's first humanity, the unstable one, begins to feel less like a separate species and more like a narrative warning. A warning about what happens when a system loses control. If you are a ruler, you fear disorder. If you are a farmer, you fear disorder. If you are God in a story, you fear disorder. Disorder is the enemy everyone agrees on, because it is the one enemy that can arrive without an army. You step into a smaller side street where a family cooks over a low fire. A child watches you, wide-eyed, then returns to a game with pebbles. The mother stirs a pot with a focus that looks like prayer. The father repairs a tool handle. Life is simple here, but not easy. You sense how much a myth of creation could matter to people like this. It answers the quiet questions. Why are we here? Why do we work? Why do we suffer? Why does the river sometimes take everything? One interpretation is that myths about a flawed first humanity provide a way to say, the world is not broken because you personally failed. The world is hard because the design was hard from the beginning. That interpretation can be comforting. It can also be controlling. Both can be true in different moments. Now, you let the cinematic imagination step forward. Gentle and clearly labeled as imagination. You picture a hidden courtyard at night where a handful of figures stand around bowls of clay. The lamplight makes their shadows long. Their voices are low. They are discussing adjustments, not in scientific jargon, but in ritual language. They speak of balance. They speak of temperament. They speak of quieting the city's restless heartbeat. It is not proof. It is a mood. It is a scene your mind paints because humans love to visualize decisions as meetings in rooms. In that imagined scene, the first human model is not evil. It is simply wrong for the system. Too curious, too loud, too free. The designers look at it the way a builder looks at a wall that will not hold. And then, softly, with no theatrics, they decide to do it again. You return to solid ground. In real history, societies do it again. Metaphorically, all the time. They reform laws. They reorganize labor. They resettle populations. They reshape culture through education and ritual. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian city life changes over centuries through cycles of expansion, conflict, and reorganization. If you want to understand the double creation idea without claiming a literal laboratory redo, you can see it as an echo of that reality. A first model of society forms, proves unstable, and gets revised. A popular rumor claims that somewhere in the missing gaps of the tablet record, there are explicit lines about an earlier humanity being wiped away entirely. This rumor is compelling because it promises a clean story. But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it remains thin. Fragmentary texts and multiple versions make it hard to speak with certainty. The more cautious explanation could be that the erasure feeling comes from later storytellers emphasizing the reset theme, because resets are dramatic, and drama makes stories stick. You pass a wall where someone has painted a simple symbol, maybe a mark for a worker group or a household. It is not grand art, but it is human. You touch the wall with your fingertips. It is warm. The warmth surprises you, and you realize the day has been hot enough to store heat in brick. That warmth is the sensation you carry as the story settles in your mind. The first human model, as imagined in myth, is energetic and unstable. The system responds with correction. The city continues around you, indifferent to interpretation, busy with survival. A donkey brays again, louder than any committee, and you almost smile because if the gods truly hated noise, they picked the wrong planet to manage. Another light joke floats by. It is bold to complain about humanity being loud in a world where goats exist. You breathe. You let the night air cool your face. You allow the narrative tension to hold without forcing a conclusion. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The first version in the story feels like a draft, a rough sketch on wet clay, and drafts, in any era, can be revised. You walk toward the river at a time of day when the light turns syrupy and slow, sliding across the water in long, trembling bands. The breeze smells of wet silt and crushed greenery, and there is a faint sourness too, the kind that tells you something organic is always decomposing nearby. The river is peaceful, but it never looks fully harmless. It has that quiet confidence of something that has outlasted every argument. Most historians agree that the ancient Near East experiences real floods, droughts, and environmental stresses, and that cities rise and fall through a mix of natural forces and human decisions. That is the solid ground. The more foggy question is how ancient stories compress those realities into memorable myths. A more cautious explanation could be that many wipeout narratives are not a single event at all, but an overlay of multiple disasters gathered into one dramatic memory. You reach a place where the riverbank is reinforced with reeds and woven mats. Workers stand with poles, poking and testing the edge. Their faces are calm but alert, the way you look at a pot that might boil over. You realize the city's relationship with water is intimate and tense. Water is life, but water is also correction. A small shrine sits near the bank. Simple and practical. Someone has left a bowl with a bit of bread and a handful of dates. The offering is not flashy. It is a polite conversation with the forces that could ruin everything. You notice a group of elders on a low platform, speaking quietly. Their tone suggests they are discussing something serious but not theatrical. You edge closer, listening. They talk about past years when water rose too fast, when walls softened, when storage rooms got soaked, when people had to move quickly with only what they could carry. Their words are plain. No metaphors, just memory. This is the kind of memory that gives birth to myth. Now the story you are following wants an erasure. It wants the first human attempt to be removed. How do you erase a population in the language of ancient imagination? One way is water, another is fire, another is silence, another is administrative forgetting, the kind where a name stops being written down and the person might as well vanish. Archaeology suggests that cities sometimes collapse, get abandoned, get rebuilt, or get resettled. Layers form, one atop another, like a stack of unintentional history pancakes. People do not always vanish. They relocate, they merge, they change identity. But myths can simplify. Myths can say, everything was wiped away, because a clean reset makes moral sense. It gives the world a before and an after, even if real life is messier. You sit near the shrine and let the river's sound become a steady hush. The fan hum in your room can blend with it, and the blend is soothing, like you are lying close to a giant sleeping animal. You focus on the idea of deletion, not as a computer button, but as a human habit. When something fails, people often try to erase it by rewriting the story. One interpretation is that erasure in ancient texts can represent political change. A dynasty falls, a new king takes power. The new order wants legitimacy, so it highlights one origin story and minimizes another. Temples promote their patron gods. Scribes prefer certain versions. Over time, earlier narratives fade. They are not burned in a dramatic bonfire. They are simply not copied. And in a world where memory lives on clay, not being copied is a kind of death. Historians still argue whether ancient flood stories preserve the memory of specific catastrophic floods, or whether they are primarily mythic frameworks built from repeated experiences with water and loss. That debate sits right beside you on the riverbank like an extra shadow. The river does not answer. It just keeps flowing. A boat passes. Low in the water, loaded with bundles of reeds. The boatman uses a pole, and the motion is slow and practiced. You watch the pole dip. Push, lift, dip again. The rhythm is hypnotic. A child on the boat trails fingers in the water, making little ripples. You feel a quiet ache at how ordinary life continues even when disaster is always possible. Now the mystery side offers you 3 doors, and you can peek through each without claiming you live there. Door 1 is flood. In the cinematic imagination lane, you picture the river rising in the night, not as a horror scene, more as a relentless fact. Water climbs the steps. It presses into doorways. It steals the edges of walls until bricks soften and slump. People carry sleeping children in grain sacks, moving to higher ground, eyes reflecting lamplight. In this what-if mood, the first human model is erased because the settlement patterns, the social structure, the records, all get swallowed. The bodies are not the point. The system is. The system dissolves, and the story remembers it as total. Door 2 is fire. Fire can bake clay tablets and preserve them, but fire can also destroy roofs, granaries, and neighborhoods. Archaeology suggests that some cities show burn layers, evidence of conflict or accident or both. In the imagined lane, you picture a storage room catching, flames licking along reed mats, smoke crawling along the ceiling. People run with jars and babies and whatever their arms can manage. In this mood, erasure is not about a cosmic decision, but about a fragile city losing its stored memory. When records burn, identities blur. A community can feel erased simply because its paperwork is gone. Door 3 is quiet deletion. This is the creepiest of the 3. But you keep it calm. It is not monsters. It is administration. You imagine a council deciding to relocate a workforce, to reorganize rations, to rename groups, to stop using certain designations. In a few years, the old category no longer exists. The people still breathe, still cook, still laugh, but the story of who they were is gone. If you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the first humanity could be erased by being absorbed and redefined, not by being physically wiped out. You stand and walk along the bank, toes sinking slightly in the mud. The mud is cool now, and you feel it cling, reluctant to let you go. You think about clay again. Clay records, clay bricks, clay bowls, clay figurines. Clay is the medium of both building and remembering. So if erasure is going to happen, it will happen through clay too. Through what gets written and what does not. A scribe approaches the shrine, carrying a small tablet and a stylus. The scribe kneels and writes a short note. Maybe a prayer, maybe an inventory, maybe a record of an offering. The act is simple and intimate. The wedge marks appear. You realize how much power is in the hand that writes. Not power like lightning, but power like selection. The writer chooses what counts. One interpretation is that myths about wiping out an earlier version of humanity can reflect a cultural need to explain why older ways are no longer acceptable. If a society reforms, it may feel like a new humanity is being created, even if the same people are still there. New rules, new rituals, new political structures, new expectations. The old self is erased in a symbolic way. That interpretation is suggestive, not conclusive, but it fits how humans talk about change even today. People say, I am not the person I was. Societies can say the same. Now for a fringe tidbit, labeled gently. A fringe idea proposes that the erasure described in some mythic patterns is intentional, like a controlled reset to remove an earlier human type that was undesirable. This is not widely accepted, and there is no strong evidence that ancient texts describe a literal engineered wipe in modern terms. But, as a bedtime theory, it invites a moody question. What if the first humans were too hard to manage, and the solution was to start over? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it remains, thin. Yet the mood can still be useful, because it pushes you to consider what manage means. Ancient states manage people through taxation, labor obligations, and ritual calendars. That is documented. So even without a literal engineered reset, the idea of redesign can be mirrored in how societies enforce conformity. You wander into a low, marshy area where reeds grow thick. Birds settle into the stalks, and their calls soften as dusk deepens. A fisher checks a trap, moving slowly to avoid startling fish. The fisher's hands are skilled, and the skill feels like a quiet kind of knowledge that does not need writing. You think about the possibility of people living outside the city system, in liminal places like marshlands. Archaeology suggests that not everyone lives in the same dense urban way, and that there are rural and semi-mobile lifeways alongside city life. In an interpretation lane, marsh dwellers could become the perfect carriers of survivor myths, the people who slip through the cracks of official narratives. But tonight, the focus is erasure. So you stay with the question of what disappears and why. You find a small mound of broken pottery near the edge of higher ground. The shards are worn. Some have simple patterns. You pick one up and rub your thumb along it. It is sharp, but not dangerously. It feels like a reminder that every object here has lived a life. Every object has a story, but not every story is told. A sudden gust of wind moves through the reeds and makes them whisper. The sound is soft and constant. Like the world exhaling, you let it calm you. You're not here to be scared. You're here to be curious in a sleepy way. You imagine the city at night after a disaster. Not a dramatic montage, as just the quiet that follows. Lamps fewer, streets emptier, dogs quieter. The smell of damp brick and ash. People speaking in small voices. In that hush, a new narrative can be born. The old narrative might feel cursed. The old narrative might feel wrong. So the storytellers shape a new one. Most historians agree that myths and rituals can adapt to social change and trauma. That is a mainstream anchor. A careful reading might suggest that catastrophic motifs in these stories help communities process loss and restore a sense of order. And the cinematic, what-if mood is this. What if the first humanity is not erased by a single flood, but by the collective decision to stop being that version of themselves? You return to the shrine and see that someone has added another offering, a small cup of beer. The cup is plain. The beer smells yeasty and sweet. You almost laugh again because even in the face of cosmic uncertainty, humans still say, "Here, have a drink. Please be nice to us." It is both humble and relatable. Another light joke drifts in. If gods exist, they probably appreciate snacks. Because honestly, who doesn't? The river darkens. The sky turns velvet. Stars appear slowly, as if they are being placed one by one. Mesopotamians watch stars closely, sometimes for calendars, sometimes for omens. What's broadly accepted is that celestial observation is part of their intellectual life. One interpretation is that the sky offers reassurance that something remains ordered even when the ground does not. You stand at the bank, listening to water. You do not claim a single answer for erasure. You let multiple possibilities breathe. Flood, fire, silence, politics, trauma, memory. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And as the night settles, you feel the idea of a reset hovering like mist above the river. Not proven, not denied, just waiting, like clay that has not yet dried. You leave the river behind and step into a landscape that feels softer, less angular. The city's straight lines fade into winding paths through reeds and low brush. The ground is springy in places, damp in others, and your footsteps make quiet sucking sounds like the earth is tasting you. A dragonfly darts past your face, then vanishes as if it was never real. The air is cooler here, layered with the smell of water plants and distant wood smoke. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamia is not one uniform environment, but a mix of cities, fields, canals, and marshlands, and that people live in varied ways across that landscape. The evidence we do have points to communities beyond the temple and palace core. People who fish, herd, farm, and move along waterways. That is your mainstream anchor. It matters because if stories talk about survivors, the marsh is a believable place for survival. It is hard to govern, hard to map, hard to control. It is the kind of place where official narratives get muddy. You see a cluster of reed houses, their walls woven tight, their roofs low and curved. Smoke rises in thin ribbons from a small opening, and it smells like burning reeds and something sweet. Maybe dates roasting. A woman steps out, looks at the sky, then looks at you without surprise, as if strangers wandering out of nowhere is just another Tuesday in the marsh. She gestures toward a low bench and goes back inside. No questions, no drama. The marsh has taught everyone to conserve energy. Inside, the light is dim and warm. A clay lamp flickers, a pot simmers. The walls breathe faintly, reeds shifting in the breeze. A man mends a net with fingers that move like they know the future. A child chews on a piece of bread and stares at you with the serious focus of someone deciding whether you are friend, threat, or entertainment. You listen to their talk, and it is practical. Fish, water level, a cousin who married into a village nearer the canal. But then, in the way humans always do, the talk tilts into story. They mention people who live farther out, deeper in the marsh. People who do not come to market often. People who are said to be different. Not monsters, not supernatural. Just different. Quiet. Hard to read. This is where the idea of a remnant can begin to take shape without needing to claim certainty. One interpretation is that survivor motifs in ancient stories can reflect the reality of population shifts. Some groups remain when cities collapse. Others move, others merge, others become invisible to record keepers. Archaeology suggests that people do not vanish neatly. They adapt, they relocate, they change their labels. That is the cautious, realistic frame, and yet the marsh lends itself to mystery. It feels like a place that could hide a secret simply by being inconvenient. You step outside again and follow a narrow path along a canal cut into the reeds. The water here is still, reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. You see ripples and wonder what made them. A fish, probably. Your brain tries to make it a sea monster, but you gently tell your brain to relax, because this is bedtime, not a panic simulator. A small boat glides in, pushed by a pole. The boatman wears a simple wrap and a calm expression. He nods at the family, exchanges a few words, then looks at you with mild curiosity. The boat carries baskets, fish, reeds, maybe a few clay jars. Trade happens even here. The marsh is not isolated. It is connected, just in its own quiet way. Most historians agree that trade and movement along rivers and canals are central to Mesopotamian life. That mainstream fact gives you a realistic channel for how stories travel too. A rumor can float downriver as easily as a boat. A song can move from a reed village to a city courtyard. A myth can pick up new details the way a net picks up weeds. Now you meet an old man sitting alone on a raised patch of dry ground. He is carving a small piece of wood with a knife, not in a threatening way, more in a meditative way. He looks up as you approach. His eyes are clear and tired. He does not speak at first. He just watches, as if deciding what kind of story you deserve. Then he talks, and the words come slowly, like water seeping through soil. He speaks of a time when the water rose and the city people panicked. He speaks of people arriving at the marsh edge with bundles and children, begging for shelter. He speaks of some being taken in, and others turned away because there is only so much food, only so much space, only so much kindness available before kindness becomes self-destruction. His story is not a myth. It sounds like memory, or at least like a memory-shaped tale. Historians still argue whether survivor narratives in ancient traditions preserve specific community memories of displacement and refuge, or whether they function mainly as symbolic patterns to explain continuity after catastrophe. That debate lives in the space between the old man's words and your imagination. One interpretation is that the first humans in the double creation theme could be a metaphor for an older social order, an earlier way of living that gets overwhelmed by a new centralized system. Those who refuse the system might be pushed into margins, marshes, deserts, mountains. In that reading, the remnant is not a separate biological creation. It is a cultural remainder. People who live differently and are labeled as leftovers, but there is also the cinematic what if, clearly marked as imagination. What if there really was a first attempt, and a few of them slipped away? Not superhuman, not glowing, just different in temperament, in memory, in the way they speak. What if they are the kind of people who do not fit city routines, who dislike walls and schedules and ration lists? You follow the old man to a place where the reeds part and reveal a small shrine built from driftwood and clay. It is not official. It is not grand. It is personal. Small figurines sit on a shelf. Rough human shapes, a few animal forms, and one figure that looks oddly elongated. You cannot tell if it is meant to be a god or simply a sloppy hand at work. The old man smiles slightly, as if he knows you will overthink it. A fringe idea proposes that such figurines and folk shrines preserve traces of older beliefs that existed before formal temple religion standardized things. This idea is not widely accepted as a proof of a separate first humanity, but it can be a useful lens. Folk practices often survive in margins. When official religion shifts, older habits can linger in quiet places. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the remnant could be as simple as older stories told in reed houses instead of temples. You sit near the shrine and listen to the marsh sounds. Frogs, birds settling, the faint slap of water against reeds. The old man tells another story, this one more mythic. He speaks of people who were made too awake, people who could not stop asking why. He says the world did not like them, not the gods, not the kings, not the river. The world preferred people who followed rhythms and did not dig too deep. You take that carefully. It is a story, not a document. It could be the old man's poetic way of explaining why some people are restless. It could be a warning to children to behave. It could be a subtle critique of authority. One interpretation is that stories about too curious humans act as social pressure, encouraging conformity. Another interpretation is that they preserve a real tension between centralized control and local independence. The Marsh family brings you a cup of water. It tastes faintly of plants. You drink anyway. You do not want to be rude to ancient hospitality. And also you are thirsty from walking through what feels like a giant, wet blanket. Another light joke drifts in. You realize this is the original spa experience, except the spa is mosquitoes and the treatment is humility. As darkness deepens, you notice small lights across the marsh, lamps in other reed houses, flickering like low stars. You feel how a network of small communities can survive almost invisibly, even as cities rise and fall nearby. Archaeology suggests that rural and peripheral populations can persist through periods of urban collapse, maintaining practices that do not always show up in official records. That mainstream anchor helps the remnant idea feel grounded, at least in the sense that people can endure outside major centers. Now, you are invited to meet someone deeper in the reeds. A young man offers to guide you by boat. You step carefully into the boat, balancing like a newborn deer. The boat wobbles, then steadies. The young man grins, not unkindly, and pushes off with the pole. The water opens around you, black and glossy. The boat moves through narrow channels, reeds brushing your shoulders, whispering against your clothing. The sound is soft, like fabric rubbing. The young man points to a mound ahead, a slightly higher patch of land with a few trees. As you approach, you see a small group gathered around a fire. Their faces are lit from below, making them look solemn, not scary. They are eating fish and talking quietly. They look at you, then return to their talk. You sit at the edge of the circle. Someone hands you a piece of fish. It is salty and smoky. The taste pulls you into the moment. These are not ghosts. They are people. Their conversation turns to names. Not personal names, but categories. They mention a word that sounds like it refers to the first ones, or the earlier ones, or the people who came before. You cannot be sure, because language shifts and memory plays tricks. But the idea's there. Identity defined by being earlier. A popular rumor claims that hidden communities preserve direct lineage from a vanished first humanity. This rumor is captivating, but it is not supported by clear evidence in the way modern listeners might want. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, as a bedtime theory, it creates a mood, a quiet pocket of people carrying a story that the city forgot. Most historians agree that myth and identity often intertwine, and that groups can define themselves through origin stories, especially when they are marginal or pressured. One interpretation is that claiming descent from an earlier, purer, or different creation can be a way to assert dignity. It can be resistance wrapped in myth. The fire crackles softly. Sparks rise and vanish. Someone begins to hum, a tune without words, just a thread of sound. You feel the calm settle deeper. Your eyelids grow heavy. The marsh's darkness is not threatening. It is protective. It hides you from the city's demands. Now the cinematic what if enters, gentle and clear. What if among these people there is someone whose eyes are slightly different, whose gaze feels older than it should, not in a supernatural way, but in a way that makes you think of inherited memory, of a story carried in the body? What if the first humans were not erased completely, but diluted, folded into later populations, leaving only faint echoes in temperament, in dreams, in that odd sense some people have of not belonging to the system? That is not a conclusion. That is a possibility. It is suggestive, not conclusive. But it is the kind of possibility that makes bedtime stories hum. The group by the fire begins to speak of the city again, but not with hatred, with distance. They say the city wants order. They say the city eats people with schedules. They say the city forgets the marsh because the marsh cannot be counted easily. You nod, because you understand that being uncountable is a kind of freedom, and also a kind of vulnerability. A more cautious explanation could be that the remnant idea is simply the reality of peripheral communities surviving through upheavals, later romanticized into myth. That explanation is enough on its own. But tonight, you allow the mist to remain too. Because the mist is soothing and because mystery can be a lullaby when handled gently. The boat returns you to the reed houses. The family's lamp is still burning. The woman yawns. The child is asleep on a mat. The man has finished mending the net, and his hands rest in his lap. Finally still, you stand outside one last time and look across the marsh. The little lamps flicker. The stars above do the same. Two kinds of light, two kinds of memory. You feel the idea of survivors settle into you, not as proof of an erased species, but as a reminder that not everything important gets written down. You wake into a city, morning that smells like fresh bread and damp brick. The air is cooler than you expect, and it carries that early quiet where even the loudest place pauses to stretch. A rooster calls out like it is filing a complaint with the universe. Somewhere a pot clinks. Somewhere a child laughs once, then gets shushed. The world is turning its gears again. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian urban life relies on routines, ration distributions, market days, temple schedules, labor assignments, and festivals that structure time. That mainstream anchor matters because the idea of a second creation does not have to mean a supernatural redo. It can also mean a system becoming standardized. A careful reading might suggest that texts emphasizing order, duty, and kingship reflect societies tightening the rules, making humans more predictable within the social machine. You walk toward a courtyard where people line up. A clerk sits at a low table. A stack of small tablets rests beside him like a pile of compressed decisions. He calls names. He measures grain. He notes amounts. A seal gets rolled. Each person receives a portion. Nobody looks delighted, but nobody looks surprised either. This is routine survival, a quiet contract between the institution and the body. You watch how the line moves. No one shoves, no one argues loudly. There is tension, yes, but it is contained. The contained tension is the point. You can almost feel the pressure of civilization pressing down, shaping behavior the way a potter shapes clay. One interpretation is that myths about remaking humans can mirror this kind of social shaping. Instead of imagining a literal new species, you can imagine a new template of citizenship. A person becomes human in the official sense by being counted, fed, taxed, trained, and placed into predictable rhythms. In that interpretation, the second creation is not about biology. It is about governance. But tonight's story also wants some cinematic mist, and you can carry both at once without confusing them. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You step into a scribal hall where older students copy longer texts now. Not just practice signs. They copy hymns praising order. They copy stories that justify kingship. They copy rules. You notice a pattern. The language is more confident when it speaks about hierarchy, more polished, more like it has been rehearsed for generations. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian texts often reinforce social roles, presenting kings as chosen, temples as central, and order as sacred. That is not shocking. Every system writes itself into the story. A young scribe looks up, eyes tired, and gives you a look that says, "I too would like to lie down in a cool room forever." You silently bless him with modern empathy. Another light joke drifts in. You realize the first invention of writing was basically the first invention of paperwork, and that is either a triumph of civilization or a warning label. Depending on your mood, outside, a procession forms, not a grand parade, more like a practical ritual. Priests carry a small statue. Musicians play simple rhythms. People follow in a loose line. The ceremony moves through the streets as if it is drawing a boundary around chaos. Most historians agree that public ritual helps maintain communal identity and reinforces institutions. That mainstream fact is an anchor. The ritual tells everyone, we are one people under one order. Now you watch what happens when ritual meets daily life. A man who was grumbling in the market becomes solemn as the statue passes. A child stops running. A vendor pauses mid-sale. In that pause, you see the power of shared meaning. It is not brute force, it is participation. One interpretation is that the second creation is essentially this: people becoming teachable, trainable, willing to adopt shared rhythms, not because they are mindless, but because synchronized behavior keeps the system stable. This might support the idea that the mythic language of remaking humans is a poetic way to describe social domestication. Historians still argue whether these texts primarily reflect elite ideology imposed downward, or whether they also preserve popular beliefs and mutual agreements that ordinary people genuinely embrace. That debate matters because it changes whether you read the second creation as manipulation or as cooperation. It may be both. Humans can be shaped and consenting at the same time. You take a side street and find a workshop where someone is making standardized weights. Small stones or metal pieces, each carefully measured. A scale hangs from a beam. The maker adjusts a weight by scraping it, testing again, scraping again. The work is meticulous. The goal is consistency. You stare at the weights and you feel the metaphor land softly. Standardization. The second creation as standardization. Not a monster story, not a science fiction story, but a story about a society learning to make its parts fit, in a mainstream sense. Complex economies require standards. In an interpretive sense, standards shape humans too. A woman comes in carrying cloth. The cloth has a simple pattern, repeated. The repetition is comforting. You realize that repetition is the city's love language. Repeat the pattern, repeat the ritual, repeat the measurement, repeat the law. In return, you get stability, at least for a while. Now the mystery lane opens its own little door, carefully labeled. A fringe idea proposes that version 2 in the creation theme represents an intentional redesign, as if the first attempt produced humans who were too unpredictable, and the second attempt produced humans with more constraints. This is not widely accepted as a literal historical event. There is no clear evidence of an engineered biological redo, but as a bedtime theory, it can be framed as a metaphor for how institutions limit behavior. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the constraints could be education, law, and ritual rather than genes. You walk toward the palace area, where the architecture looks slightly more confident, the walls are thicker, the gates are more controlled. Guards stand, not with theatrics, just with posture and routine. Most historians agree that kingship and palace administration become increasingly central in many Mesopotamian periods. Alongside temples, that mainstream anchor is stable. It is also relevant because kings like origin stories that make them necessary. Inside a public hearing space, a dispute is being settled. Two men argue about a field boundary. A judge listens. Witnesses speak. A scribe records. The judge's decision feels final. The men leave, not happy, but resolved. You feel the strange comfort of a system that can end an argument without bloodshed. Not always, of course, but sometimes that is a form of civilization. One interpretation is that the second creation is the emergence of humans as legal subjects, recognized and managed by institutions. The first creation might be imagined as too wild for this. The second is adjusted for life in a world of contracts. Again, that is interpretation, not certainty. But it fits the shift from survival chaos to structured society. You step out into a courtyard where a teacher instructs apprentices. The teacher demonstrates how to set a brick straight, how to align corners, how to measure. The apprentices watch, then imitate. The teacher corrects them with a firm tap on the shoulder, not cruel, just precise. The work is method. The goal is predictability. Now you let the cinematic imagination paint a scene, gently and clearly. You imagine a quiet chamber where a divine assembly discusses humanity the way an architect discusses a building. They do not speak of love or hate. They speak of stability. They speak of ratios. They speak of making humans easier to feed, easier to count, easier to guide. It is not proof. It is a mood. It is a way of visualizing the pressure toward order that real societies demonstrate. And you notice something else. The second creation, in this mood, is not necessarily kinder. It is more efficient. Efficiency can be comforting, but it can also be constraining. You feel that tension as you watch the city function. People know their roles. Roles reduce anxiety. Roles also reduce freedom. A priest passes you carrying a basket of small clay figurines, likely offerings. Each figurine is simple, mass-produced. They look similar, as if stamped from the same idea. You hold one in your mind and think, yes, that is it. A standardized human. Another light joke drifts in. You wonder if somewhere there is an ancient complaint tablet that says, "Dear gods, the new version has bugs." And honestly, that would be the most relatable artifact imaginable. You return to the market, and you see how the city handles difference. A traveling merchant speaks with an accent. Locals listen, curious but cautious. Goods change hands. Information changes hands too. The system absorbs novelty slowly, filtering it. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cities engage in long-distance trade and cultural exchange. That mainstream fact suggests a world that is not closed. Yet exchange also increases the need for standards, because if you trade with strangers, you need shared measures, shared expectations, shared legal norms. Historians still argue whether the growth of standardized institutions increases overall stability at the cost of local autonomy, or whether it is mostly a mutual adaptation that benefits many groups. That debate maps neatly onto the double creation theme. Is the second creation an improvement or a compromise? In myth, it can be both depending on who is telling it. You stop at a doorway where a woman sings while grinding grain. Her song is not a performance. It is a tool for pacing work. The rhythm keeps her moving. It also keeps her calm. You realize that humans shape themselves too. They create routines inside routines. They build little worlds of meaning inside big institutions. So perhaps the second creation is not only imposed, perhaps it is embraced. A more cautious explanation could be that as societies become more complex, people adopt new identities, new skills, new rituals, and those changes feel like becoming a new kind of human. The myth language of creation captures that transformation in a vivid way. The sun climbs higher, the morning cool fades, the city becomes louder, yet the noise is different from wild chaos. It is patterned, predictable, managed. It is the sound of version 2, not as biology, but as civilization. You breathe in bread smoke, dust, and the faint sweetness of dates. You feel yourself settling into the rhythm, and you understand why a story would call this a new creation. It is a new way of being human. You wander into a part of the city where the streets smell like herbs crushed underfoot. Someone has scattered fresh greenery near a doorway, maybe to scent the air, maybe to ward off insects, maybe because humans love pretending they can negotiate with nature using aromatherapy. The sun is high now, and heat shimmers above the brick like invisible steam. You seek shade instinctively, like every sensible creature. The temple annex stands open, not the main sanctuary, but a working space. Inside, women and men move with quiet authority, not hurried, not lazy, just focused. Bowls line a table, bundles of reeds hang from beams, a mortar and pestle sits ready. The air has a layered smell, clay, beer, oil, and something metallic that could be a pigment or simply the sharp scent of tools. Most historians agree that temples in Mesopotamia are not only places of worship but also centers of production, healing practices, and ritual expertise. That mainstream anchor matters because it makes the creation imagery feel grounded in real human spaces. People here know how to mix things properly. They know how to measure. They know which herbs calm a stomach and which ones make you regret every choice you have ever made. They know how to prepare offerings and how to prepare bodies for life and death rituals. The temple is practical sacredness. A midwife steps forward, wiping her hands on a cloth. She speaks to a younger apprentice, pointing at a bowl and then at a list of items on a small tablet. The apprentice nods and fetches water. You watch this and feel how knowledge is transmitted. It is not mysterious. It is taught, yet it is also surrounded by ritual language, because ritual gives weight to the moment. In many Mesopotamian myths, creation uses birthing imagery and craft imagery together, shaping and delivering, molding and breathing. A careful reading might suggest that goddesses involved in creation can reflect real social roles, especially in the domain of birth and healing. That interpretation is not a claim that myth is literally a record of a specific midwife. It is a way to see how storytelling honors and mythologizes essential work. You sit quietly, listening. A woman sings a low chant, not loud enough to be a performance, just steady enough to hold the room's attention. The chant might be part prayer, part instruction, part timing device. You notice how timing is everything. Boil this long. Stir that many times. Speak these words at this moment. The sequence matters. The sequence is power. Historians still argue whether the ritual texts and mythic motifs should be read as literal descriptions of practices, or whether they are symbolic and literary structures that borrow the language of practice without being actual manuals. That debate is perfect for tonight, because the mood of a workshop of creation sits right on that boundary. It might be metaphor, it might be inspired by real ritual, it might be both. Now the cinematic mist arrives, calm and careful. You imagine that this annex is the kind of room people picture when they talk about making humans twice. Bowls, clay, quiet voices. A sense of design in the imagined scene. The watchers are not necessarily aliens or monsters. They are supervisors, not of a lab, but of a ritual and an institution. They could be divine in the story, or they could be human officials in reality. The myth gives them god names because god names make authority feel larger than life. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the watchers could represent the gaze of the system itself, the feeling that someone is always observing, measuring, recording, in a city built on records. That feeling is not paranoid. It is practical. A priest enters carrying a small clay figurine. The figurine is shaped like a person with hands clasped. It is simple, but the face is surprisingly expressive. The priest places it near a bowl, murmurs words, and then leaves. The action is gentle. No fireworks. Just a quiet deposit of meaning. Most historians agree that votive figurines and offerings are common in Mesopotamian religious practice, often representing devotion or requests. That mainstream fact grounds the object, but you also allow a softer interpretation. A figurine is a miniature human, a small stand-in, a symbolic body. It is not a stretch to imagine that a culture surrounded by miniature humans would also imagine humans as crafted objects at the cosmic scale. You watch the midwife demonstrate how to wrap a newborn. She uses cloth with practiced precision, supporting the head, securing the limbs. The apprentice mirrors her movements. You see how a human becomes safe through technique. Technique is love expressed through competence. Now you consider the double creation theme through this lens. One interpretation is that the first model of humanity fails not because of biology, but because of inadequate social wrapping, inadequate instruction, inadequate containment. The second creation is the improved method. Better training, better ritual, better social fabric. That reading is suggestive, not conclusive, but it feels plausible in a culture that values method. The room's air grows warmer. Someone opens a small vent. A breeze moves through, and the hanging reeds sway slightly. You notice a set of small tools, bronze or copper implements for scraping, cutting, mixing. The tools glint. The glint triggers your modern brain to whisper, "Laboratory." You smile at your own brain and gently correct it. It is a workshop. Workshops are the original laboratories. People have always experimented. They just did not always call it science. Here comes the required fringe tidbit, framed safely. A popular rumor claims that ancient creation scenes are coded descriptions of engineered reproduction, as if the temple annex is a hidden lab and the midwives are technicians in disguise. This rumor is not widely accepted, and there is no solid evidence that myths describe genetic procedures in a modern sense. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and it is thin. Still, the rumor persists because it offers a neat explanation and a thrilling mood. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor may be pointing not to literal engineering, but to the awe people feel toward birth and skilled practice. Birth can look like magic when you do not have medical textbooks. And even with textbooks, it still looks like magic, just with more paperwork. A young apprentice hands the midwife a bowl of water. The midwife tests it with her finger, then nods. That small nod feels like approval, like the system working. You realize how often humans seek approval from those who know more. That dynamic can be mythologized into God's approving creation. You step outside to cool your face. The street is bright. A donkey stands in a patch of shade, chewing slowly like it has discovered enlightenment. You envy it. Another light joke drifts in. The donkey looks like it has achieved inner peace solely by refusing to make eye contact with responsibilities. You move toward a smaller shrine near the annex, and you see inscriptions carved into plaster. Names of deities, short petitions, simple praises. People touch the wall as they pass. A woman presses her forehead to it for a moment, then continues on. The gesture is intimate. Most historians agree that personal piety exists alongside state ritual, and that individuals engage with the divine through offerings and prayers. That mainstream anchor matters because it shows the creation story is not only political, it is also personal. People want to know why they exist, not only why the king rules. In the shade of the shrine, an old priest tells a short teaching to a group of listeners. He speaks about the body as a vessel, the breath as a gift, the heart as a place where duty and desire wrestle. His words are poetic, but the message is practical. Live in a way that keeps balance. Historians still argue whether such teachings reflect a widespread moral philosophy among ordinary people, or whether they are mostly priestly ideals promoted through ritual and education. That debate matters because it changes whether the second creation feels like a top-down program or a shared aspiration. You watch a woman carry a bundle of cloth into the annex, and you realize the workshop is also a womb in metaphor, not only for babies, but for identities. People enter and leave changed, healed, blessed, instructed, reassured. If the city shapes humans through rations and laws, the temple shapes humans through meaning and ritual. Now the cinematic what if returns, softly. What if a group of specialists once performed a ritual that symbolically remade a person? Perhaps during an initiation, a healing, a purification, a re-entry into society after illness, not as evidence of literal second species creation, but as a ritual language of rebirth. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, such rites could contribute to stories of making humans twice, because in lived experience, people can feel remade. A careful reading might suggest that myths of creation and recreation can mirror real rites of renewal performed at New Year festivals or temple ceremonies. In many cultures, renewal rituals reset the world symbolically. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian festivals include ideas of cosmic order being reaffirmed. That mainstream anchor supports the idea that remaking is a familiar religious theme. You return to the annex and see a small clay tablet on the table with a list of ingredients. The apprentice reads it aloud, stumbling on a sign, then correcting herself. The midwife nods. Patient, the moment is tender, knowledge passing from hand to hand. A human being created again, not from clay, but from teaching. You notice a basket of small amulets, each one tied with a cord. A cord is such a simple thing, yet it binds. You think about binding as a metaphor for the second creation, binding people to rules, binding communities to calendars, binding children to lessons, binding the unknown to a name so it feels less scary. A fringe idea proposes that these binding motifs conceal a deeper story about controlling the first human type, restraining something too wild. This is not widely accepted, but as a bedtime interpretation, it can be a mood, if we treat it as possibility. The wildness might be human unpredictability, and the binding might be socialization. The heat outside is intense now, but inside the annex, the air remains steady. The chant continues softly. The bowls remain lined up. The work continues. You realize that whatever creation means in the myth, it is also echoed here in the everyday. Mixing, shaping, instructing, caring, you step back into the street and let the brightness wash over you. You feel the city's pulse. It is not violent. It is busy. It is controlled. It is full of people being made into who they are, again and again, through routine and ritual. You breathe. You feel calm. You let the mystery be a gentle fog, not a trap. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And in the shaded annex, the idea of humans being made twice becomes less like a headline and more like a human truth. People are shaped, reshaped, and shaped again by the hands of their world. You step into a scribal courtyard where the shade is patterned, because woven mats hang above and let sunlight through in neat rectangles. Dust floats in the light beams like tiny slow dancers. The air smells of warm clay and inkless effort, that particular scent of hands and earth working together. A young scribe is carrying a stack of tablets as if they weigh nothing, which is either impressive or a sign that their back pain will be legendary. Most historians agree that scribes in Mesopotamia are trained specialists who copy, preserve, and adapt texts, and that what survives to the present is shaped by what scribes chose to write and keep. That is your mainstream anchor. It also sets up a crucial idea for tonight. Stories can be made and remade without anyone needing to rewrite reality itself. A narrative can change, and that change can feel like a new creation. You sit near a wall where a teacher is discussing something with older students. The tone is not scolding. It is strategic. They are debating which version of a hymn to recite at an upcoming ritual. One line praises a god with one title. Another line praises the same god with a different title. The difference sounds small, but the room treats it like a political decision. A careful reading might suggest that origin stories and divine genealogies can be edited to serve authority. If your city's patron deity is framed as central to creation, your city becomes central by implication. If your king is described as favored by the gods who made humans, your king's rule feels less negotiable. This is interpretation, but it is a reasonable one, because humans everywhere use stories to justify power. You watch an apprentice trace signs in wet clay, then smooth them out and try again. The ease of erasing and rewriting feels almost symbolic, like the material itself is encouraging revision. Clay forgives. Clay allows drafts. Clay invites the idea that an earlier version can be rubbed away, leaving only a faint smear. This is where a memory war can happen. Not a war with swords, a war with emphasis, a war with copies, a war with what becomes official. Historians still argue whether scribal culture mostly preserves tradition faithfully, or whether it actively reshapes tradition to meet new political and religious needs. That debate matters because it gives you two plausible ways to interpret the double creation theme. Either it reflects a deep, persistent idea carried across centuries, or it reflects competing versions that get merged, with one version later framed as first and another as second. You drift toward a table where a senior scribe is reviewing tablets. He reads signs quickly, almost without moving his lips. His finger taps the clay lightly at certain phrases, as if the phrases have weight. He pauses at a line about humans and duty, then makes a small mark in the margin, an editorial note. The mark is subtle, but you realize subtle marks can change history. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts exist in multiple versions, copied across different cities and periods, and that we often have variants rather than one fixed canonical wording. That mainstream anchor is important. It means the ancient world is not a single script. It is a chorus. Now you step into a hall where diplomats and temple officials meet. They are not shouting. They are bargaining politely, which is the ancient form of shouting. A representative from a nearby city wants recognition for a particular festival date. Another wants a certain divine title used in a shared ceremony. It is all framed as devotion, but you can feel the politics underneath. One interpretation is that origin stories become tools in intercity competition. If your city can claim that it preserves the truest account of creation, you gain prestige. If you can claim that your temple holds the oldest tablets, you gain authority. In that reading, who gets to be first is not a biological question. It is a legitimacy contest. You notice a small chest near the wall, sealed with clay and impressed with a cylinder seal. The chest likely contains tablets that are considered important. The seal is not just a lock. It is a statement. This is protected knowledge. You feel your modern curiosity flare. Protected knowledge always makes people imagine secret knowledge. Here comes the mystery lane, carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that certain older creation versions were intentionally suppressed, and that a first humanity story was trimmed away because it was inconvenient. This rumor is not widely accepted as a proven historical event. We do not have a simple, documented record of a committee deciding, erase the first human's narrative. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and it is thin. But as an interpretation, it is plausible that some versions fade because they do not serve the current order, or because a city loses influence, or because a library burns, or because scribes simply stop copying a text. You walk past a wall where tablets are stored in niches. Some niches are empty. That emptiness feels loud, not dramatic loud, but like a pause in a song. You wonder what used to be there. A treaty, a hymn, a list, a myth. You cannot know. And the not knowing is fertile ground for bedtime mystery. A more cautious explanation could be that what we call erasure is often the result of ordinary loss, decay of unbaked clay, recycling of tablets, destruction in conflicts, accidental fires, or simple neglect. In that view, there is no villain. There is only time. Time is the most reliable editor. Yet even with ordinary loss, human choices matter. A scribe chooses what to copy. A teacher chooses what to teach. An official chooses what to fund. Those choices shape what survives. You step outside and cross into a public square where a bard is performing. The bard's song is about kings and gods. The crowd listens. The song includes an origin line that makes the city sound chosen. People nod. They like being chosen. It is emotionally efficient. Most historians agree that oral performance and written texts interact, with stories moving between spoken and written forms. That mainstream fact supports the idea that variation spread naturally. A line added in performance can later be written down. A written line can later be sung. Over time, the public memory shifts. Now the cinematic imagination enters. Gentle. You picture a room at night where scribes sit with lamps, copying a long story. One scribe hesitates at a passage describing an earlier human type, a rougher version, a version that does not fit the current moral lesson. The scribe glances at a senior official. The senior official does not speak. He simply raises an eyebrow. The scribe smooths the clay and writes a different line. The first version disappears into a smear. That is not a claim of fact. That is a scene designed to capture a possibility that social pressure can rewrite stories without any formal decree. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the erased first humans could be as simple as a discarded draft of identity. You return to the scribal courtyard and see a group of students practicing royal inscriptions. They carve phrases praising the king's justice, the king's strength, the king's connection to the gods. The repetition is intense. You realize these students are being trained not only to write, but to participate in a worldview. Their hands learn ideology through muscle memory. One interpretation is that this training itself is a kind of creation. It makes a person into a scribe. It makes a child into a function. It makes language into authority. In that reading, the second creation is about producing citizens who support a certain order, while the first creation is imagined as a time before such training exists. Historians still argue whether the earliest phases of urban life are characterized by more fluid social structures, later replaced by stricter hierarchies, or whether hierarchy is present from very early on. That debate matters for how you imagine the first humans. Are they a fantasy of wildness, or a memory of a less standardized world? You walk toward a small chapel where a different god is honored. One not at the top of the city's official hierarchy. The chapel is quieter. The offerings are simpler. A few locals whisper prayers. The god's name is spoken softly, like a family nickname. You sense that different layers of belief can coexist. official and personal, grand and intimate. A fringe idea proposes that such minor cult spaces preserve older creation motifs that do not align with the official temple narrative. This theory isn't widely accepted as direct evidence of a suppressed first humanity, but it is a reasonable possibility that local traditions can differ. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the first humans might survive in regional stories that never become central. You sit in the chapel and let the quiet settle. A fly buzzes, then leaves. A candle flickers. The air is cooler, and you feel the gentle pull of sleep. Outside, a messenger runs past carrying a tablet in a leather pouch. He is fast. The pouch bounces. The message matters. You think about how messages shape reality in real time. A king's order can relocate people. A temple edict can change ritual practice. A legal decision can redefine a person's status. In that context, rewriting a creation story is not trivial. It can reshape how people see themselves. A more cautious explanation could be that the double creation theme arises because different groups hold different self-understandings. One group says, "We are made for labor and order." Another group says, "We are born of the wild places and older ways." When these identities collide, stories can be stitched together, leaving the impression of two beginnings. You walk back through the courtyard and notice a pile of broken tablets near a wall. Discarded practice pieces. The fragments are litter, but each fragment once held a full intention. You crouch and pick up a piece, reading a few signs. A name, a title, a phrase about making and serving. Then the fragment ends. You realize that history is full of fragments like this. You build stories from them, you fill gaps, you argue, you dream, and the city keeps writing itself, one wedge at a time. You step into an open terrace above the busiest streets, a place where the breeze actually reaches you and the heat loosens its grip. The city below is a textured hum. Voices, hooves, vendors, distant chanting, and the occasional argument that sounds like it began over bread and escalated into a philosophical debate about the universe. Up here, the noise becomes a soft blanket. You can breathe. A man sits near the edge with a small board and pegs, keeping notes. He is not looking down at the market. He is looking up. His eyes track the sky with a patience that feels almost supernatural, except it is just practiced attention. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars observe celestial movements and develop astronomical and astrological traditions, using the sky for calendars and omens. That is mainstream ground. It also fits tonight's mood because when humans feel uncertain, they look for patterns somewhere reliable. And the sky is the oldest pattern book. You sit beside him? Quietly. He does not start a conversation. He simply points. A bright point of light hangs near the horizon. Steady and confident, he marks something on his board. You realize he is not making guesses. He is recording. The evidence we do have points to systematic observation and long-term record-keeping, and that kind of discipline shapes how people interpret everything else, including origin stories. In a world where the sky can be read, the idea of humans being made can also be read. People look for signs that they are part of a designed order. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, as a divine group in some traditions, can become a cosmic symbol for authority itself. The kind of authority that seems to come from above, literally and socially. That interpretation is not a claim of secret code. It is a way to understand why sky language feels powerful. The observer lifts a hand as if he is weighing the air. He speaks softly, describing an omen, not doom, not fear, just a possibility. He describes what might happen if the pattern repeats. A careful reading might suggest that omen traditions are not always fatalistic, but often practical. Like an early warning system for rulers, if you believe the sky is sending signals, you can justify decisions. You can prepare. You can claim legitimacy when things go well. Historians still argue whether ancient omen systems reflect genuine religious conviction, political strategy, or a blend of both, where belief and power feed each other. That debate matters because it mirrors tonight's theme. Are origin myths about humans being created twice a sincere cosmic story? A political tool, or both? A cloud slides over the sun briefly, and the city below dims. The shift is small but noticeable. People pause, then continue. You feel how quickly human mood can change with light. Imagine how an eclipse would feel. Imagine how a comet would feel. The sky can make the world feel fragile without touching the ground. Now the mystery lane opens gently. A popular rumor claims that unusual sky events recorded in ancient texts are evidence of contact or intervention by powerful beings. This rumor is not widely accepted. Most scholars interpret these records within the context of ancient astronomy, religion, and politics. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the leap from omen record to literal visitors is thin. Still, the rumor persists because it is cinematic. It turns the sky from a calendar into a stage. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the rumor can still do something useful. It reminds you that ancient people experienced the sky with wonder and seriousness, and wonder is the doorway through which big myths enter. You watch as the observer hands a small tablet to an apprentice. The apprentice copies the notes carefully. The act is slow and reverent. You realize that copying the sky is like copying a myth. Both are attempts to make uncertainty manageable. Down below, a royal messenger passes through the crowd, and people step aside. Power moves on the ground while patterns move above. The two are linked. The king needs the sky for legitimacy. The sky needs the king for interpretation. That is not a literal need, but a cultural one. One interpretation is that the second creation theme can be tied to omen thinking. If humans are remade, perhaps the world itself is periodically reset. And the sky provides the timing, not as a scientific claim, but as a mythic sensibility. In such a worldview, unusual celestial events can be read as signals of transition. As if the cosmos is updating its settings, you descend from the terrace into a street where an omen reader sits at a small table. People bring questions: health, travel, business, marriage. The reader listens, then casts lots or examines a small object, then speaks in careful language. The language is cautious, full of might and may, because certainty is risky. You nod approvingly. The omen reader is basically the ancient version of a responsible narrator. Most historians agree that divination is a significant part of Mesopotamian religious practice, used by individuals and rulers. That mainstream anchor helps you understand why cosmic language is everywhere. It is not just superstition. It is a social technology for decision-making under uncertainty. You hear a child ask the omen reader a question that makes the adults laugh. The child wants to know if a goat will like him. The omen reader answers seriously, which makes everyone laugh more. Another light joke drifts in. You realize the oldest recorded question in human history is probably some version of, "Will the goat approve of me?" And honestly, that feels correct. As evening approaches, the sky's color deepens. The observer from the terrace is still working, eyes tracking a point that is now brighter in the twilight. He speaks with a temple official, and the official nods. A decision is being prepared, not necessarily a dramatic decision, but perhaps a ritual adjustment, an offering, a proclamation. The sky gives the institution an excuse to act. A fringe idea proposes that the sky law encodes deeper memories of a final conflict among gods or a turning point that leads to human redesign. This idea is not widely accepted, and it often blends different myths and later interpretations in a way that is difficult to verify. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still function as a bedtime mood, the heavens as a silent witness to transitions humans barely understand. You walk to the city gate where people gather at dusk to watch the horizon. Not everyone is an expert. Many are simply curious. The horizon feels like a promise and a threat at the same time. A trader points at a bright object and tells a story about a king who ignored an omen and suffered. The story might be true, might be exaggerated, might be a moral lesson. The crowd listens anyway, because moral lessons wrapped in sky drama are memorable. Historians still argue whether specific omen narratives are based on real events later mythologized, or whether they are invented examples designed to teach caution and obedience. That debate keeps your feet on the ground. You can enjoy the sky story without treating it as a documentary. A careful reading might suggest that the language of heavenly assembly in some traditions reflects the structure of human assemblies, councils above mirror councils below. Deities become metaphors for forces and offices. In that interpretation, the Anunnaki can be understood as a narrative way to talk about cosmic governance, the idea that reality has administrators. That might support the idea that creation is also administration. You pause near a wall where someone has painted a simple star symbol. It is crude but confident. You touch it lightly. The plaster is warm, still holding the day's heat. You realize that warmth and starlight are the two sensations you associate with certainty. Warmth tells you the sun existed. Stars tell you the night exists. Between them, humans invent meaning. Now the cinematic what if arrives, soft as a lullaby. What if, on certain nights, the sky feels like it is watching back, not with eyes, but with pattern? What if the people who first told the twice-made story tied it to a night of strange alignment? A comet, an eclipse, a bright planet hanging unusually low. They might have felt the world shifting. They might have told a story to contain that feeling. Not because it was scientifically accurate, but because it was emotionally accurate. A more cautious explanation could be that the double creation theme is amplified by the Mesopotamian habit of reading signals in everything. Sky, liver divination, dreams, unusual births, floods, and political unrest. When you live in a pattern-hunting culture, a major social change can be framed as a cosmic redesign. You walk through a quieter street as night fully arrives. Lamps glow in doorways. The smell of stew drifts out. Cumin and onion and something smoky. You hear someone reciting a short prayer to a household god, asking for protection. The prayer is gentle. It is not about grand cosmic secrets. It is about safety, sleep, and tomorrow's bread. Most historians agree that household religion exists alongside state religion, and that people seek divine support in daily life. That mainstream anchor grounds the story again. Even if the sky is vast and mysterious, humans still need dinner. A popular rumor claims that certain stars or planets were considered the literal homes of gods who intervened directly. This rumor has roots in ancient associations between deities and celestial bodies. But modern literal interpretations often go further than the evidence supports. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, as a bedtime possibility, you can imagine the sky as a map of divine bureaucracy. Each bright point a desk lamp in an unseen office. You let the idea settle and soften. The city's noise fades into a distant murmur. The sky above is clear, deep, and calm. You feel yourself becoming quiet too. Like the city is teaching you its nighttime version of order. You walk to the edge of the city where the brick thins out and the land opens again, flat and wide, the kind of horizon that makes you feel small in a calming way. Night is settled. The air is cooler. Somewhere out in the fields a frog calls, then pauses, as if even the frog is listening to the silence between stars. A faint wind moves through dry grasses and makes a soft, steady brushing sound, like a broom sweeping worries out of your mind. Most historians agree that myths are not simple lies or simple facts, but living stories that carry values, fears, and explanations across generations. That is your solid ground for the ending. Myths can preserve memory of real hardships, real social changes, and real human psychology, even when their imagery is divine and poetic. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian societies that are intensely organized, intensely observant, and intensely aware of how fragile order can be. So you hold the double creation idea carefully, like a clay bowl that could crack if you squeeze too hard. One interpretation is that made twice is not about literal biology, but about social redesign, cities forming, collapsing, reforming, and producing new kinds of citizens who fit new rules. Another interpretation is that made twice reflects competing traditions stitched together, leaving the impression of two beginnings, and the cinematic what if, the mist you allow for bedtime, is that there might have been a first attempt that did not endure, leaving only faint echoes in stories, in margins, in the parts that are hardest to confirm. Historians still argue whether the most dramatic reset motifs in Mesopotamian tradition reflect specific catastrophic events, or whether they are largely symbolic frameworks built from repeated experiences with disaster and recovery. That debate matters because it keeps you honest. It keeps you from turning a mood into a claim. It reminds you that mystery is most soothing when it stays gentle. You sit on a low rise of packed earth and let your gaze drift across the darkness. In the distance, you can see a few lamps, isolated points of warmth. The city is quieter now, but not asleep. Somewhere a guard calls out. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere a baby fusses, then quiets. Life continues, small and steady. Now you ask the last question in a way that does not demand an answer. What remains in you, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion? The first humans might be a metaphor for raw humanity, restless, curious, uncontained. The second humans might be the shaped version, trained, measured, woven into routines. You can feel both inside yourself. Some days you are the wild question in the back of your mind, the part that wants to run into the dark and see what is there. Other days you are the person who wants a schedule, a list, a plan, a predictable cup of tea, and a bedtime that arrives on time. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians place great importance on order, both cosmic and social, and that their rituals and institutions aim to sustain it. That mainstream anchor helps you understand why a story about creation might also be a story about control. Control is not always cruel. Sometimes it is simply the boundary that keeps a canal from turning into a flood. But control can also become a cage. And humans have always lived in the tension between safety and freedom. Here comes a final fringe tidbit, framed with care. A fringe idea proposes that the double creation story hints at deliberate intervention, as if a powerful group chose to reset humanity, leaving one version behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no strong evidence that ancient texts describe a literal engineered redesign in modern terms. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, The idea survives because it gives shape to a feeling many people recognize. The feeling that you are designed for something you did not choose. The feeling that life sometimes has rules that seem written by someone else. You stand and walk slowly, letting your footsteps match the night's pace. The ground is cool. The air feels clean. You can hear your own breathing, and it becomes part of the landscape, like a quiet instrument joining a larger song. You notice a small canal glinting faintly under starlight. The water moves gently, always moving, never stopping. It is a reminder that time flows through everything, even through stories. A more cautious explanation could be that the strongest echo of a first and second creation is simply the human habit of reinvention. People rebuild cities. They reform laws. They recover from disaster. They teach children new ways. They tell stories to explain why the new way exists. And then, eventually, they tell stories about how the old way failed, because every new order wants to feel necessary. You stop near a small field where the soil has been turned recently. The furrows are neat. Someone has planned tomorrow's work already. The neatness is almost tender. It is a human saying, "I will be here again. I expect the world to continue. I'm betting on continuity." That bet is what makes civilization possible. Now the cinematic what if slips in, soft and dreamlike. What if, somewhere deep in the mind, there is an inherited memory of being shaped, of being assigned, of being told what you are for? Not a literal genetic memory in a scientific sense, but an emotional one. A feeling that you are both free and directed, both wild and guided. The myth of being made twice becomes a poetic way to talk about that inner split. You look back toward the city. The ziggurat silhouette rises against the sky like a dark mountain made of human effort. You think about the people inside those walls. Bakers, scribes, farmers, priests, children, merchants, guards. Most historians agree that these societies are complex and resilient, building systems that can last for centuries even as they change. Their stories reflect that resilience. Even their mysteries reflect it. Because mystery is a way to keep listening, a way to keep learning without forcing certainty. Historians still argue whether we should treat these myths primarily as literature, primarily as religion, primarily as political ideology, or as a blend that cannot be separated. That debate is not a problem. It is a gift. It allows the story to remain open, and open stories are the ones that keep you company in the dark. Now the wind down begins, slow and gentle. You walk a little farther until the city sounds fade even more, and the night feels like a blanket laid carefully over the land. The stars are steady. The river is distant but present, like a low hush at the edge of hearing. You feel your shoulders loosen. You feel your jaw unclench. Your hands, if they were tense, begin to soften. You imagine, calmly, a bowl of clay resting in a quiet room. Not a dramatic room, not a secret lab, just a simple space where someone is making something useful. The clay is cool, the hands are patient, the shaping is slow. In that image, creation is not a shocking event. It is a process. And process can be comforting. You let the double creation idea become a lullaby rather than a riddle. One layer is the documented world of canals and cities and scribes and temples. People building order because water and time demand it. Another layer is interpretation, where you see how stories might mirror power, trauma, and social change. And the softest layer is imagination, where you allow a misty possibility that something older lingers in the background. Not as proof, but as atmosphere. You breathe in, slow. You breathe out, slower. The night air is cool against your skin. The earth beneath you feels stable. Whatever was erased in any story, you are here now, safe in this moment, listening to a calm voice, letting history turn into sleep. Your thoughts drift like small boats on the dark water, unhurried, untangled. The city in the distance becomes just a shape. The ziggurat becomes a shadow. The stars become gentle pinpricks of light. Not messages you must decode, just quiet company. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you allow one last simple truth to settle. You do not need to solve the mystery tonight. You only need to rest beside it, the way you rest beside a river, listening to it move, trusting that it will keep flowing whether you watch it or not. End of script. Sweet dreams.